In today's episode, we ask the question, was this woman abducted by a cannibal monster from Dene legend, or is the RCMP just that bad at their job? I'm Aiden Madison, welcome back to the Lore. Have you ever come across one of those stories of park rangers or fire lookouts who experience something unexplainable in the woods? They'll be out there minding their business, and then there are strange sounds from beyond the light of their cabin or camp. A twig will snap, a strange cry may come from the woods, and the skin prickles on the spine as the narrator realizes suddenly that the only thing more unsettling than being alone in the forest is not being alone in the forest. The stories frequently differ in their details, but the one through line is that a wilderness professional ends up being chased by someone or something until finally, at long last, the protagonist reaches safety. Now, these stories are almost exclusively fictional, but there is a reason I use the word almost. Back in August of 2006, Stephanie Stewart was coming to the end of her 13th season at the Athabasca Fire Tower, a little outpost 8.5 miles west of the small town of Hinton, a rail stop town of about 10,000 inhabitants and the last true population center before Canadian Highway 16 makes its entrance into the Rockies towards the border with British Columbia. Now, Stewart began spending her summers there in 1993, 5 years after taking a job as a lookout with the Alberta government's Office of Sustainable Resource Development. It was a job that, by all accounts, she absolutely loved, despite the fact that it meant months living out in the dense forests of Western Alberta. You know, if you look at a satellite photo of the province, there's one thing you're bound to see, and that thing is trees. With over 81,000 square miles of forests, Alberta's woodlands alone cover a larger land area than countries such as Ireland and Czechia, and there have been no shortage of mysteries amongst its dark woodland expanses. From monsters to murderers, Alberta has had its fair share of horror stories, and the latter are actually often the more terrifying. But that doesn't change anything about how vast and important these forests are, or how vital the job of a fire lookout is. And Stephanie Stewart was very happy to do it. From April through October, she'd sit atop the 50 or so foot tall structure, diligently reporting on weather conditions and potential fires. And even on days where hang gliders would stay grounded due to high winds, Stephanie was up in her tower, unfazed as it rocked and swayed. According to her friend Robin Slater, Stewart lived for the outdoors and genuinely enjoyed the solitude provided by the position, where Slater said her friend was happiest. And even into her later years, Stewart's mind remained sharp, so in her free time she would read, craft, and paint. On the other hand, she was physically healthy enough to put any 50-year-old to shame, and she'd sometimes go for walks on the nearby trails to get exercise, or on occasion she'd hop into her gray pickup to head into Hinton for supplies and conversation. But most importantly, she never missed any of the 3 daily check-ins that fire lookouts with Alberta Sustainable Resource Development are required to make, something that ASRD spokesperson Annette Bidniak described as completely out of character for her. So, when she didn't call in on the morning of Saturday, August 26, 2006, it very quickly rang alarm bells. And you know what else is ringing alarm bells lately? The amount of takeout that I've been eating, because I simply do not have the time to cook and go grocery shopping nearly as frequently as I should. Now, the problem with that is, if I get takeout all the time, I'm not only spending entirely too much money, but don't look at the calories. Do not look at the calories on your takeout meals. And that's why I'm really grateful for the existence of Factor, which we've been working with them for a very long time now, and for good reason. From the first moment that they sent us a package, I was legitimately impressed with the quality of this food. And that's why we are partnering with them yet again to sponsor today's video. Now, don't get me wrong, I still like to cook a homemade meal every now and then, and it's great to go out for dinner every once in a while. But on those nights where I'm just kind of working late and I just need something that's ready to go, that I don't need to wait 30 minutes for or cook myself, Factor is awesome. It completely eliminates the hassle of prepping, cooking, cleaning up. You just pop it into the microwave and it's good to go in 2 minutes. And I know that largely due to the last year of our lives, there have been a lot of concerns out there about sustainability and conservation. And the fact of the matter is that with Factor, you can rest assured that you are making a sustainable choice. And that's because Factor offsets 100% of the delivery emissions and sources 100% renewable electricity for their production sites and offices. And I know what you're thinking, well, I'm probably gonna get bored really quickly. How many meals can they possibly have? The answer is over 35. That was one of the things that I found most exciting about Factor when I first started using it, was that I didn't have to worry about selecting from the same 6 options all the time. Factor's chefs have a much wider recipe book than I do personally up here. So you get to choose from a weekly menu of at least 35 options that are all chef crafted and dietitian approved, and every single one of them is fresh and never frozen. And if you've got a special diet, like you're trying to cut your calories, you're thinking about keto, you want more protein, or if you're vegan or vegetarian, they've got that for you. And you can also get add-ons, you can get snacks, they have breakfasts. I gotta be honest, the pancakes are pretty damn good. And while this might be utterly shocking, the filet mignon is great. Those gourmet options are usually a couple extra dollars, but gotta say, it's worth it. At the end of the day, as we've expressed over and over again, we try to only partner with brands that we genuinely love, and Factor is one of them. So if you would like to give Factor a shot and try the same experience that we have had here at the Lodge, you can head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code LORELODGE to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That is code LORELODGE at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. When Stephanie Stewart failed to check in on that fateful Saturday morning and to answer a number of calls from her colleagues, a supervisor headed out to Athabasca Lookout Tower to see what was going on and hopefully locate the 5-foot-tall, blue-eyed, and gray-haired 70-year-old. But when they arrived, Stewart was nowhere to be found. Her gray pickup remained parked outside, and inside of her cabin, a pot of water sat simmering on the stove. The ASRD contacted police, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police began search procedures. Teams were dispatched to explore the woods in case Stephanie had wandered off for some reason or another, while other officers searched her cabin for some sign of where she had gone. But then something very out of the ordinary happened. They almost immediately began a criminal investigation. Now that's strange because in most of the Canadian cases we've covered, the RCMP has been absurdly reluctant to consider foul play. For example, when Bart Schleier disappeared 2 years earlier in the Yukon, the Mountie spent an hour poking around his campsite before deciding he must have journeyed 20 miles overland to the nearest settlement of Stewart's Crossing, despite the fact that all of his supplies had been left at camp. When his friends performed their own search and located some of his belongings, and a follow-up revealed bloody clothing and a few scattered body parts, the RCMP chalked it up to a bear attack. And even after conservationists and wildlife experts told the Mounties that it seemed very unlikely he was attacked by a wild animal, and his friends noted that he used to track and tag Siberian tigers for a living, the RCMP still refused to investigate a potential homicide. 4 years after Stephanie's disappearance, when Amber Tuccaro vanished from a motel outside of Edmonton after being picked up by a strange man for what was reportedly a date, the RCMP not only failed to launch a search effort, but they also took her off of the missing persons list because an anonymous phone call informed them that she was safe and sound. At the time, they were actually sitting on a phone call that she herself had placed the night she was abducted, which was recorded because she called her imprisoned brother while being kidnapped. Something she likely did because she knew that phone call would be recorded. Now, she was eventually found deceased several miles east of where she'd last been seen, and the RCMP never found her killer. So that brings us to the question of why, just days into the search for Stephanie Stewart, a woman who lived in the woods and had completed such feats as solo cycling across Canada and climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, did the police begin looking into such a possibility? Well, on August 31st, 2006, the Red Deer Advocate published an article in which they explained that RCMP Corporal Al Frazier said that to protect the investigation, he couldn't reveal exactly what may have made police think Stewart is a victim of foul play. What he could say was that they'd ruled out an animal attack or a medical condition which would have caused her to wander away from the forestry tower, and that 2 pillows with blue pillow slips, a burgundy bedsheet, and a Navajo-patterned quilt were missing, along with a gold watch which the Edmonton Journal reported she kept for sentimental reasons. So all of this is just kind of weird. You know, the pot of water left simmering on the stove suggested she had left suddenly, and yet a bunch of bedding was missing. And the missing items suggested Stephanie had not left on foot, and yet her car was there. All of that was suspect, but also potentially explainable. But As it turns out, the RCMP was holding something back from the public, as up to 100 volunteers and forestry workers, 3 helicopters, trucks, and all-terrain vehicles scoured 7,500 square kilometers, that is 2,895 square miles of forest, and 4,500 kilometers of roads. Mounties were trying to ascertain the cause for one crucial piece of evidence. On the stairs leading to her cabin's porch lay a smear of blood, with no sign of animal predation and no evidence of self-inflicted injury. It was clear that someone or something had attacked Stephanie Stewart. The big question was, who? In the immediate aftermath of Stephanie's disappearance, the police were looking for evidence of an abduction or potentially even a murder. Given that this happened in Canada, there is very little information regarding how the investigation worked once foul play became the leading hypothesis. We can make some inferences based on known procedures, but beyond that, it's pretty difficult to say what they actually did. If I were to make an educated guess, I would think that they probably worked to establish how someone could have gotten in and out of the area, and unfortunately, that's actually not as easy as one might assume. The lookout tower is approximately 5 road miles from the nearest highway, that being Highway 40, or a little less than 2 miles through incredibly dense forest if you attempt a straight line. Getting there on foot is possible, but getting out with the body, the blankets, and the pillows, all without leaving a trail, seems a bit insurmountable. That suggests that a vehicle was used, in which case the most obvious route is the twisting gravel road leading to the tower, which had recently undergone improvements to make it more accessible to vehicles. Prior to that, the area was only accessible via ATV, but that kind of vehicle also adds some other ways of getting there. While the lookout tower is directly connected to the highway by road, another way off of Highway 40 is Pepper's Lake Road, which is less than a mile south of the lookout tower. And if you follow that path to the northwest, it eventually does get to a point where a vehicle would have to be at least off-road capable, but it also leads you into the mountains, or you can get back to Highway 40. If you follow it into the mountains, it leads into Rock Lake Provincial Park, which it seems is only accessible from the east, where its main road connects with Highway 40 about 20 miles to the north of the turnoff for Athabasca Lookout. So, with multiple ways in and out by vehicle, both of which would be drivable for something like a Jeep or a sufficiently outfitted pickup, and the fact that the assailant did not take Stephanie's truck, it seems most likely that her attacker drove there in his own vehicle. So the question then becomes why somebody would do this. And considering that Stephanie disappeared sometime after a phone call with her daughter Lori on the night of the 25th, it's unlikely that she was attacked by someone walking either from the highway, the nearby Nordic Ski Center, or either of the hiking trails leading from William Switzer Fire Tower Trailhead and Jasper Lake Campground. And that suggests that this was not a crime of opportunity, but something premeditated, though it's hard to see why anyone would want to kill her, a sentiment shared by her daughter Lori. None of the papers mention anyone who might have reason to harm her, nor any potential romantic partners with whom a fight could have turned deadly. The reality may very well be that the perpetrator didn't actually intend to kill Stephanie. They may have either overheard her mentioning her gold watch in town, or simply assumed that somebody living out here might have something of value. If that's the case, then a rather nonsensical murder becomes a very understandable robbery gone wrong, and the only remaining issue is that of who did it. We know that Stephanie had been working at Athabasca for over a decade, and there were certainly plenty of people who knew that there was a 70-year-old woman living all by her lonesome several miles from the nearest residence. In addition, a September 2006 article in the Edmonton Journal cites local resident Louise Benbow as saying that there was a horrible problem with crack cocaine in Hinton in recent years. Calvin and Cheryl Bauer, owners of a bed and breakfast at the junction of Highways 16 and 40, held the same concern, with the Journal reporting that they were worried about the drugs that have followed the big wages of the oil and gas sector into the Hinton area. And Cheryl was quoted as saying that they had a suspicious death across the highway 2 or 3 years ago, and in that case, this was connected with methamphetamine. Now that could certainly explain the situation, as an unscrupulous addict might think of this as an easy way to score some money for drugs. Someone could have made their way to the cabin that night, tried to rob Stephanie, and then found out that she was surprisingly spry for her age, only to accidentally kill her in the struggle. The blankets and pillows are a little bit harder to explain, but they could have been taken either to distract investigators by making them think that she went camping, or alternatively, they could have been used to hide her body in the backseat of a car or the bed of a truck. Either way, there is an explanation that does not conflict with the rest of the suggestion. Then again, there's the pot of water. If whatever happened to Stephanie occurred the prior evening, then the water would likely have evaporated by the morning. But since it was still simmering, That suggests the attack happened that very morning, especially if the supervisor had to drive out from the ASRD offices in Edmonton, though it's not clear where the supervisor actually was located prior to checking in that morning. Either way, it certainly narrows the timeline, but not in a way that makes it impossible for someone to get there, commit the crime, and then get out of town. Unfortunately, it is hard to say if the police managed to find any suspects, if they cleared everyone, or if they just didn't bother to try, because Canadian law enforcement is not forthcoming about case details even on 20-year-old cold cases. And if we just look at the case, it took them over a decade to tell people about the smear of blood. That came out in 2018. However, one man was brought up as a potential connection years later. Travis Vader, who was convicted for the 2010 murder of septuagenarian couple Lyle and Mary McCann. According to Canadian outlet Global News, the McCanns were last seen fueling up their motorhome in the town of St. Albert, north of Edmonton, on July 3, 2010. Their bodies were never found, but their burnt-out motorhome was, and a friend of Vader's testified that he showed up later that same day driving an SUV, matching the one belonging to the couple. In addition, the keys to the McCann's SUV were eventually found in the bed of a stolen, burnt-out truck that a witness said Vader had been driving several months after the murder. Investigators also determined that on the day of the murder, several calls and text messages were sent to Vader's former girlfriend from the McCann's cell phone from the Edson area, where the motorhome was eventually located. Other evidence later led to a second-degree murder conviction, only for the judge to downgrade the charge to manslaughter after criticism over his use of an archaic, no longer valid law allowing for second-degree murder charges if the killing occurs during the commission of another felony. So, due to the similarity of the victims, the possibility that both were robberies gone wrong, and the location of both attacks near or along Highway 16, also known as the Highway of Tears due to the many First Nations women found murdered along its western stretch, some considered it possible that Vader may have been responsible for Stephanie Stewart's disappearance as well. Unfortunately, but honestly not unexpectedly, the RCMP has been unable to find any evidence linking anyone, even Vader, to the crime. In any case, the RCMP found themselves at a loss. There was enough evidence for it to be obvious that Stephanie's disappearance was the result of a crime, but Mounties couldn't get any further than that. And because the RCMP doesn't like to share, nobody else can pick up the case unless they're invited in. Conveniently, this also prevents anyone in the media from identifying and criticizing their failures, of which there are so very many. Now, officially, the authorities consider Stephanie Stewart to be a victim of a homicide, but they have never found a body, nor have they identified a suspect to the public. That said, there is another less traditional possibility, and it has to do with the name of the watchtower itself. Athabasca Lookout Tower is probably named for the nearby Athabasca River, which itself flows from Lake Athabasca to the far north. And it is from this body of water that the Athabascan peoples received their name, though they much prefer to be called by a term of their own language, that being Dene. As with many Native American tribal groups, the ethnonym comes from their word for the people, with Athabascan actually being an exonym based off of the Cree language term for the lake. And while there certainly were Dene people near Lake Athabasca, this was by no means the extent of their territory. Ranging from the mountains of western Alaska to the shores of the Hudson Bay, and from the Arctic Circle to southern British Columbia, the Dene were one of the most widespread cultural groups of the New World. In addition, at some point in pre-colonial history, one large Dene tribe underwent a long migration to the south, and they would eventually come to be known as the Navajo and the Apache. And others still formed a pocket group in Washington and Oregon. But it's through the northern Dene speakers, the Nahanni, Chippewayan, Dunedza, and others, that we come to the topic of this chapter. You see, there are many legends amongst the natives of this continent which speak to wild men who live off in the forests and mountains beyond polite society. In some cases, the storytellers are clear that these wild men are humans just like you and I, though at an earlier stage of civilization. In others, however, something more mystical is at play. And one such case is the Wechuge, a cannibalistic monster of Dunedza legend which derives from ancient myths held sacred by that people. According to American anthropologist Robin Wrightington, Dunedza myth cycles tell of a time when giant animals hunted and ate people. These animals behaved like people, and the people were compelled to be their game. They're referred to as wolverine person, spider person, beaver person, frog person, etc. And in the end, cultural hero Saya, after being granted supernatural powers by a disembodied voice while he lay dying on a deserted island, manages to defeat the animal people. And in remembrance of this episode, upon reaching puberty, the boys of the Dunedza tribe would go off into the wilderness and embark on a vision quest, wherein they would, if successful, speak to one of the medicine animals. animals. This animal would give them a power as well as a taboo, which is bringing up a lot of vague memories about Irish mythology from my days as a medieval studies student. The taboo was always something that they were not allowed to do, always related to the particular medicine animal which contacted the man, and each was specific to the individual. So if the individual were to break his taboo, which acted as something of a power limiter, then he risked becoming too strong, and this in turn could bring devastation to his tribe. One example given by Ridington came from his time amongst the Dunetza, while he was driving with the Dunetza prophet or dreamer Charlie Yehi, and turned on the car radio to country and western music. But as soon as it began playing, a young man in the car with them reached over and turned off the radio, an action he found most unusual since most Dunetza enjoy this kind of music and normally would not interfere with another person's choice. He asked why the younger man did this, and he replied, "Old man, he don't like that." At the time, Ridington was not fully aware of the Wechuge legend or how it worked, and so he remained somewhat puzzled. But later on, when he was informed of what happens when someone becomes too strong, it all suddenly made sense. You see, the reason Charlie couldn't listen to country had nothing to do with music tastes or cultural difference. Instead, it was the fact that his medicine animal was the spider, and therefore his taboo did not allow him to listen to any sound made by a stretched string or hide, and hence he could not hear guitar music. Ridington also related a story told to him about Charlie, in which the prophet had been in a cafe in town when the jukebox began playing guitar music, and he had begun to get too strong. As a result, he had to be ushered out by his companions, all of whom were aware of his taboos as well as those of others. When in doubt, Ridington explains, they are expected to ask if it is all right to act in a certain way or offer a certain food to a person whose powers are unknown to them. But in the case that someone accidentally broke a taboo, there would not always be some kind of transformation. Although at times I inadvertently violated personal taboos and thus became aware of them, Ridington writes, these violations were not interpreted as intentional affronts and hence did not trigger the otherwise automatic response. The same was true of children, and thus newcomers and most white people were treated in the same way. But this did not cover all white people. For example, another native man from the Dunetza tribe by the name of Jumbi told Ridington of a story where a white woman tried to take his picture with a flash camera. Now in this case, the woman was well acquainted with the tribe and knew about their taboos. And so Jumbi, being under the guidance of the Thunderbird, had to act quickly, diving under a set of blankets in order to escape the flash and avoid becoming too strong. Because becoming too strong meant becoming a Wechuge. To explain the concept, Jumbi told Ridington a Wechuge story passed down through the ages, in which a Wechuge kidnapped a young man, and the men of the tribe had to band together to go and rescue him, lest the Wechuge come for them all. In the story, about 100 Dunetza were encamped together for the winter, and one night a young man heard someone calling to him from outside of his tent. The voice told him, "Somebody wants you to visit him." And though the boy was skeptical, he was also hungry, and this somebody might have food. But instead, he walked outside and found himself face to face with a Wechuge. Before he could react, the Wechuge lunged at him, grabbed him by the throat, and then threw the young man over his shoulder to carry him back to his lair. And the only witness to any of this was the young man's wife, who heard someone calling for her husband in the night. She hadn't fully woken up, but when several hours passed without her husband's return, she began to grow anxious. She woke some of the others, telling them, "Somebody called my husband and then he went out. That was a long time ago, and I don't know where he is." So concerned, several of the men got up to search, but this young man was nowhere to be found within the encampment. Realizing something must have been gravely wrong, they woke everyone up, lit torches, and began to look for tracks leading to or from the camp. A short while later, they came upon a set of large tracks, and they understood what had happened. They knew darn well that he had taken that man, Jumbi told Ridington, and the men of the camp feared that if he's taken one, he will take every one of us. So they gathered together and came to the conclusion that they must follow the tracks, kill the Wechuge, and hopefully rescue their friend. Now, the younger men of the group were filled with confidence, boasting that they alone could handle the monster, whereas those of middle age didn't really argue, knowing full well that the younger men were likely to be humbled, and that those of more experience would be there to step in when the time came. It wasn't long before they came across the Wechuge's camp, and they quickly realized that one aspect of their mission had already failed. The cannibal had already killed his quarry, and was roasting him on a spit over a campfire. There are further details that I won't include as they're quite graphic, but you get the picture. But the good news was that this had the Wechuge's full attention, allowing for the posse to circle around behind him for a sneak attack. First, one of the young men snuck up behind the monster, then leapt onto his back in an attempt to wrestle him to the ground. And not only did that not work, but the Wechuge actually managed to reach around, grab the young man's arm, and toss him into the fire, and it's implied that this was fatal. So, as everyone had expected, the task of finishing off the monster fell to one of the older men, not elderly, but probably like 30s or 40s, who wrestled the Wechuge for an hour before finally he was able to get the upper hand. In grappling with the cannibal, he placed one hand around its neck, the other around its leg, and in a scene out of Mortal Kombat, brought the Wechuge's back down across his knee. His back broken, the Wechuge was unable to move or fight back as he was hefted once more and thrown into the fire, where he screamed, not in pain, but in anger, until his icy innards finally melted, and at last he fell silent. But of course, brute strength wasn't the only way to kill a Wechuge. One could succeed in doing so through trickery as well. In a story told by a man called Aku, a young man defeats a Wechuge by fooling him several times. Now, I debated summarizing the story, telling it as written, or rewriting it in a way that remained faithful to the text as I just did, but honestly, I really liked the way I did it the last time I talked about the Wechuge, so I'm gonna use an edited version of that script here as well. And when I say edited, I mean it is edited. This is not the same as the first time I covered this. First, however, I should note that while the Wechuge in Jumbi's story is more of a nomadic hunter, the one in Aku's lives in a well-known spot, so well known that everyone is aware a cannibal lives at that lake, and yet they still go to the lake. Why do they still go to the lake, you might ask? Well, the lake is teeming with fish and they are hungry. The Wechuge, of course, having the appearance of a man, would welcome the travelers to the lake, and then he would offer them some of his fish, like, hey, you guys hungry? You want some salmon? But because this Wechuge was also a medicine man, it was evil magical salmon served on plates made out of wood, and the plates had monsters carved in them. There's not a ton of clarification here, but Aku did say that the Wechuge would dream evil dreams and then carve his dreams into the plates, so I suppose that's how this functions. In any case, he is a medicine man who serves fish to people on plates that he carved runes into, and then the people die. So it sounds like he was using magic plates to kill people and then eat them.
And then suddenly, the salmon on the plate suddenly turned into a man, proclaiming that he was 5,000 years old.
This is not the 5,500-year-old salmon story. Do not bring Finton into this.
Any chance that there is an opportunity to bring Finton into it, why wouldn't we bring Finton into it? It's Finton!
It is Finton. Anyway, there was a boy who knew of this lake, and that boy and his grandmother were hungry, and they knew of the monster man by the lake. So they decided they were going to go to the lake that had many fish, and they were just going to go stay at a different part of the lake with the many fish. And this was a foolproof plan until it wasn't. Now, as you might be expecting, the boy was very aware of the monster, and being a boy, he was very curious, and he had a little something up his sleeve, too. You see, according to the story, he was half buffalo. And not in the sense that he was guided by the buffalo spirit. This kid was legitimately just half buffalo. So the buffalo boy goes to see the cannibal man, and the cannibal man feeds him some fish, but half buffalo boy, he doesn't die. No, half buffalo boy here, he's like Thor drinking out of the horn that drains the sea. He's just going. He is downing fish. He is like Rasputin drinking that poison wine. Like, this guy is the Joey Chestnut of trout. And as it happens, because the boy was half buffalo, he could eat as much fish as he wanted. Now, it has to be understood that the Wechuge was very confused by all of this, to the extent that he straight up asked the half buffalo boy, "How come you don't die? All the other people have died." But half buffalo boy was something of a jokester, so he told the cannibal, "Why, I'm not filled up yet. I thought you were just feeding me. I didn't know you were trying to kill me." So, once the Wechuge caught on that the half-buffalo boy could have as much fish as he wanted, because that's just how the rules of the universe work, he demanded that the half-buffalo boy throw up the fish so that he himself could eat it. Instead, the half-buffalo boy just threw up a tiny green frog, and the Wechuge ate the green frog. Now, this was something of an Uno reverse card, because upon eating the frog, the Wechuge becomes catatonic. He's not feeling well. He's got a tummy ache. So he sits down, and the boy goes back to his cabin with his grandma. But a little bit later, the Wechuge's wife comes looking for the half-buffalo boy and is like, "Hey, fix my husband. You broke him." Now, the buffalo boy comes back, and he's like, "Yeah, I'll fix the Wechuge. Don't worry about it." But instead, he takes 2 sticks out of the fire that have blackened ends, and he just jabs them into the Wechuge's neck, which kills him. And then he tells the cannibal's wife, "Well, I can't fix this man. He's already dead." I want to be clear that I recognize how seriously these stories are taken, and I don't tell it this way to deride these legends in any way. I simply imagine that some of the details of this particular story must have been told with a grin. In truth, I find all of these stories fascinating, and I wish we were able to preserve more of them. So on the off chance that you, the viewer, have stories like this from your own culture, things that typically don't make it outside of the community, I would be more than grateful for the opportunity to preserve them for future generations. But for the moment, you may be wondering two primary things. One is, how does one become a Wechuge? And the other one is, what on earth does this have to do with the disappearance of Stephanie Stewart? And you may be asking, does this guy really think she was taken by a Wechuge? The answer is no, I think it was probably a robbery gone bad, and that until further evidence to the contrary is provided, we should consider that to be the most likely option. But it just so happens that stories like this provide an excellent opportunity to talk about the folklore of a region, as I would imagine that in the not too distant past, this disappearance would be looked at as something supernatural. Therefore, putting it into the context of those kinds of legends helps us to understand where some of these tales may have originated, and to better understand our ancestors, our neighbors, and our world. But as for how one becomes a Wechuge, Wrightington does actually give us an example in the case of a man named Asa. Asa was in his 70s and had fathered several children with a woman in her 30s. Unfortunately for him, she eventually left him for a much younger man, but he still got to see the children and even had custody of their youngest daughter, a 5-year-old girl. Now, because Asa was so old, he wasn't able to hunt for himself, and he didn't have any younger members living in his household, so anybody who had fresh meat, that being any of the other hunters, when they had some, would bring him a portion. They would just care for the elderly in the tribe. And one day, there were some people staying with the community who were not members of that community, and for some reason, somebody brought him meat that had fly eggs and flies buzzing around in it. And this was a problem, because Asa's medicine animal was the frog, and his taboo therefore seems to have been that he could not eat flies or their eggs. However, because the food was given to him as a gift, and those who brought it had not asked if it was okay for him to eat it, his only option was to eat it based on the cultural rules of the tribe. So after this, he began jumping around on the bed and shouting and just generally acting irrationally, and everyone quickly realized if we don't do something about this right now, that guy's gonna become an immortal cannibal, or at least he's going to become extraordinarily violent and extraordinarily difficult to kill. And according to the information gathered by Wrightington, they become nigh immortal because their internal organs turn to solid ice, and thus they must be melted over a fire before they can be killed, as with Jumby's story. Of course, there is the alternative of being a half buffalo man and feeding the Wechuge a special green coma frog, but that seems out of reach for the common man. Now, thankfully, the Wechuge transformation isn't quite as definitive as it is with the legend we compared this to a couple of years ago, that being the Wendigo, or at least not in the way you might think. Both are caused by breaking a taboo, but the Algonquian taboo is somewhat universally, in the case of the Wendigo, greed. And greed causes the Wendigo to kill or at the very least eat his or her loved ones, neighbors, and that act of cannibalism is what pushes the Wendigo beyond the point of no return. That is to say, once someone becomes a Wendigo, the only cure is death. In the case of the Wechuge, however, this is not necessarily true, and the taboo is actually inverted in a way. That is to say that somebody can become a Wechuge unintentionally, while the Wendigo has to choose that path rather than allowing him or herself to starve. And this is perhaps best demonstrated by the cannibal act involved in becoming a Wechuge, which is the final stage of the transformation process. A man can be saved from this fate if, and my apologies if I am misunderstanding any of this, someone is able to calm him using a medicine blanket or medicine song before he bites off his own lips. So with the Wendigo, the act is eating someone else, while with the Wechuge, it's eating part of yourself. Now in this case, Asa avoided being killed because his youngest daughter was able to go and get his medicine bag and wrap him in his medicine blanket and sing his medicine song to calm him down. Altogether, these stories tell us some important details about the Wechuge. We know that they are intelligent and capable of rational thought, even deceit, but we also know that they're still slaves to their cannibalistic desires. We also know that they can live either near people or deep within the wild. As I said with the first story, that was one that lived off in the wilderness, was not close to people, and was very much a hunter of men. But in the second story, there's something of a social aspect. When it comes to fighting them, it seems that fire is deemed in some way necessary, in that you either have to slow roast them so their icy organs melt, or you have to stab them with charred sticks after feeding them the coma frog. At the end of his article, Wrightington suggests that the Wechuge is, at its core, mankind returning to the role of the giant man-eating animals. In other words, the Wechuge is a human being who has become one of them in spirit, and ultimately is overcome by their influence or their nature. So the man who becomes a Wechuge has been overwhelmed. He's too powerful, and as a result, he must now eat other people. And I do want to reiterate that I don't think that a Wechuge took Stephanie Stewart. I think it was probably a normal person. But at the same time, when you think about the situation, in a way, it probably was taken by somebody who broke a taboo and as a result killed other people. So there's always little things within these stories that you can see whether they're meant to be understood as mythological, whether they're meant to be understood as allegorical or literal. There are these kernels of lessons we can learn from these stories that we're not that different from the people who came before us. They just thought of things in a somewhat different way in many cases. And that's not to say that there weren't any cannibals out there, living amongst the Donetza. There probably were. We actually come across these stories a lot all over North America. But I'd like to know what you guys think, as always. Do you think that I came to the right conclusion here regarding the idea of it being a robbery gone wrong? Do you think it probably was something mythological? What are your thoughts? And of course, if you have a story from your culture, I would love to hear it. I mean that completely sincerely. I have very much enjoyed the ability to go and explore other stories from people that are different from me. I think that's one of my favorite things about this job. And if you'd like to support us as we continue to do this job, there are a number of ways you can do so. You can get our merch, you can wear the Lodge, that comes from Bunker Branding. It is all American made, and it was designed by a mix of us and Bunker's graphic design team. We have 4 different t-shirt designs in a few different colors, we have a couple of hoodies, and I gotta say, it is all some of the most comfortable stuff I've ever worn. If you'd prefer to drink the Lodge, you can do so by going to tableauroastingco.com, linked in the description, and ordering Mount Pocono Perk. That is our signature coffee that I designed myself. I did not pick it off of the shelf. I did not just rebrand something. I talked to the owner of the roastery, Matt Moore, and I said, hey, here's what I want. And he gave me what I want, and now we have a wonderful medium dark roast that is sophisticated enough to drink black and enjoy it. If you're that kind of person, I personally am. Or if you are the kind of person who likes to put cream and sugar in it, or just cream, which to be honest with you, is also the kind of person I am. Or if you're looking to just directly support us monetarily, we do have Patreon, as well as YouTube memberships, though I will tell you that the Patreon gets you a few more perks, like some gifts after 3 months of membership, that the YouTube subscription does not come with. You also get access to our exclusive show, Liquored Lore, which we have to shoot another one of soon. That is basically I get drunk and talk about the stuff we usually talk about. We, of course, pick topics that are a little bit less sensitive for that, but you get the point. And when I say drunk, I don't mean I'm pounding like 20 shots of Fireball. Don't worry. More like 13. But if you're looking for even more Lodge, then you can check out our other channels. Seems like we're going to be launching a reaction and commentary show on the Aiden Mattis channel, and we're also going to be adding some shows to the Weird Bible, and of course there is the History Unhinged channel. So those are currently our 3 big ones. Weird Bible returns, actually, if you are watching this video, yesterday. If you're watching it upon premiere, the Weird Bible podcast returned yesterday. It will, going forward, be the final Thursday of every month, and we will be selecting a different strange story from the Bible to go over. And this is a show done by myself and Wendigoon, with Thornbury working as a producer and audience surrogate. So if you haven't seen it before, it is a show about Christianity done by Christians, but not necessarily just for Christians. We talk about these, in a very open context, and I don't try to preach at you. Neither does Isaiah. Our new show, History Unhinged, features Stephen Bell of the Stakuyi and History of Everything channels, as well as Roman Helmet Guy, myself, and of course, once again, Thornbury acting as a surrogate. The first episode comes out February 1st, 2025, and we are currently uploading a few fun little clips from it so that you can get a taste of what you're in for. Finally, with the Aiden Mattis channel, if you're watching this video as a premiere, for example, there is a solid chance that I will be live streaming a video game with a bunch of my buddies in about an hour. We do a lot of horror games, a lot of survival games, and for a little while there, we were on a run with Helldivers. We were really good at Helldivers. We also are still working to build these 2 other new channels with other hosts. Those are Boozy Mixology with Celso and Off the Record with Luke Eccles. As you might imagine, those are shows about mixology and music. And then, of course, we have our live show, The Lore Lads. That is live every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it's not. And if it's not, we'll tell you that it's going to be a different time or day. Or if it's just canceled, which very rarely happens. There's like 157 episodes of it so far. And that's in just over 3 years. If you prefer to listen, you can catch that show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get it. And very soon, this show that you're watching right now will also be coming to those platforms as both a video podcast and a totally audio-only thing. It's your choice choice of what you want to use. And last but not least, the best place to go for updates, to understand what we're up to converse with us, and to give us suggestions for things is our Discord, and you can go there by going to https://bit.ly/join the lodge, or just clicking the link in the description. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.